Hello, my name is Gary from Donman, and welcome to another part of our series of Introduction to Donman. And what we've looked at previously was the donor entry in the main screen for adding contact details and setting up campaigns. And the next part of this process or the series will be looking at how we process payments through Donman. Yeah. So we've already set up our campaigns, we've got our donors, or we're creating them. So on our Start menu, we've got the main areas here, and the first one up the top is the donation processing. The menu in this case is in the order that it needs to be, because these are the logical steps that I create when I'm doing the transactions. So my first part of the process is to do the actual entry or record donations from their banking credit card listings, depending on what I'm doing with credit cards. I can create the receipt merge data file. Depending on, again, how I'm doing credit cards, I might have an entry like this one where it's creating a card data file for credit cards, a ledger report, a refer to report if I've got staff members I need to alert about transactions that have been recorded, and the end of day update. So from the time I start recording transactions in Donman at this point here, until I finish the end of day or the end of processing cycle update, everything will stay in the temporary file. So if there's a mistake discovered or anything like that, I don't need to worry about mucking up the main data files at this point, because everything's temporary and I can go in and do any editing that I need to. This menu here is purely for doing the one-off transactions. I've done an appeal and I've got checks or credit card payments, cash, hopefully not, but they do come in, postal notes, whatever. This is more for my manual processing. On the left-hand side of the menu, we'll see there's two entries here. One is for auto deduct, and the auto deduct is where I covered in the first session of the series of demonstration videos was looking at a donor's record where you can have an auto deduction pledge. So if I've got that, I can go through the auto deduction menu here, and on the nominated day of the month, I can run an auto deduction batch of transactions. Okay. So whether I'm using a gateway or whether I'm using a program to send the credit cards to the bank, the system will do the same thing. It'll look for all the pledges that are due or past due and create a batch of those donations for me. The other option on the left-hand side here is web donations, and this is depending on where your donations are collected. If you've got a web page with Donman, then this general web import donation program will be able to import the donors and the transactions. Other than that, we start with the peer-to-peer module where we've got Everyday Hero, we've got the Go Fundraise file, there's also now a My Cause import program, and there, because online fundraising is becoming a much more widely used process for people to get donations from different organisations. So there are import programs, and for this webinar I'm not going to go into each of these, but it's really just so that you are aware that there are things or programs within the system that can be used to import that data, and it's really just a matter of purchasing the peer-to-peer module, and from there we'll get the programs, and it will read the data, it will do all the deduplication, reading the transactions, etc., instead of me doing a whole lot of manual entries. Okay. So what we're primarily going to look at today, though, is the record donations for the manual entries. So when I go into record donations, the system will say, am I doing a new batch? So the concept of a batch within Donman is just a manageable number of transactions. So if I had a chance and just had an appeal and said, oh look, I've just got a lovely load of mail in here, but I don't want to do them all in one hit, then I could say, yes, I'm starting a new batch. The system will allocate the batch number for me, and normally I would have a batch header screen that I filled, or have the operator fill out that would have the date, who it was doing that, how many donations were being entered, how much money was banked or pre-banked. So in this case here, I would say I'm going to do 2 transactions, a very small batch, and this is where I can have how much money I'm going to bank and whether I've got money banked or pre-banked. So the difference between the banked and the pre-banked means that if somebody has made direct deposits into my bank account that I just need to record through the system and receipt, then that would be pre-banked. Everything that I've physically got to bank, as far as checks and cash and things like that, then that would all be a bank total. If, perchance, I've got in this case, the 2 transactions and the total $300 to be banked, I've got nothing pre-banked, then I don't have to put a figure in there. When we write to people as part of an appeal, one of the options we have on the donor screen is to update the mail history. And if I've done that, I can then tell the system here that when I process these payments, always use the last mail code as the default campaign for my processing. For this particular one, I haven't done an appeal. I'm going to choose the campaigns manually. And the system will automatically put the operator code in, because when I log into Donman, that's what it's using. And it's also tracking what I'm doing and which programs I'm running. So when I enter through from there, the first thing I do then is find my donor. And as I discussed in the first session, looking at the donor screen, the 2 ways I would do that is either enter the donor number, if I put that on my coupon, and that's ultimately the easiest way. Otherwise, again, I would go down and I would look up my donor based on name or address. From there, I'd find my person, double click, and that will bring up the donor's record. Because I'm in the processing cycle, when I enter, the system by default will skip the whole screen unless there's something that it says is out of whack, like I've got a code on their screen or something that someone has deleted the actual underlying code in the system. By default, it will just say that's okay, and if I've got something to change or I've got an email address, I can certainly click back into that field and fill in what details I need to, but by default, to make it easier to put the transactions in, jump straight to the bottom. If I enter, it will take me through the second screen of the person's record, and again, if there's anything I need to update there, I've got the opportunity to do that. And what this also allows me to do is that if I've got a brand new person not on my system, I can add them at the time I'm processing. So I don't have to do the sort of housekeeping step first and then come and do the transactions. I can do them all as part of that one process. If I then enter, say I've now been through the 2 screens of my donor record, the donation date by default will go in, but if I was backdating stuff because it was something that had been directly deposited in the account or whatever it might be, I can change the date here. The system will store the 2 dates. One will be today's date, being the 4th of the 8th, or it will also store the entry date. So if the chance I had backdated this and said, okay, look, this should have been the 1st of August because I had something that came in last week that I haven't yet processed, I can put that in, but the system will store that it was actually entered today. So that comes in handy, especially the beginning of the financial year where we might be inundated with transactions and we just don't have time to get them all finished, but ideally they should be postmarked 30th of June so that people can claim them on their tax for the previous year. From there, I'd put in the transaction amount. If I've got something that people have said, oh, here's the money, but I want this to go into 2 different areas or 3 different areas, then up the top here I can say that there's now 2 parts to this transaction. And down the bottom of the screen here, you can see I can now split the payment internally. So for banking purposes, I've got one payment of $150, but for the ease of me saying, well, some of this money was for a donation, the other part was for a sale or something like that, then I can certainly change that up the top of the screen. For the first one I'll just do a single transaction. From there I have all the pay methods. Okay, as you can see, quite a list of different pay methods that I can put in. If perchance I choose check, the system will then go across and ask me the bank and branch details off the check. Whether you use the BSB number or you put that it's ANZ and the branch, doesn't really matter to the system. A lot of organisations do like to use the BSB number because it's a whole lot less you have to type in and it's going to be 100% accurate. With the big banks, that's fairly easy. When you get to the smaller regional banks or, credit unions and things like that that are associated with a bank, sometimes it's hard to know what to put in there, whereas if I use the BSB, it's never going to cause me a problem. If the drawer name was different from what was on the check, then I can just change this to suit, and the system will store that, so next time I process a check, that'll automatically come out. So I want that because, again, I might have a record where I've got a Mr. and Mrs. record, but the check has come from one, or I might have a single donor where it's a joint check account. So that way I can get the drawer name to suit, so when I do the bank deposit slip, that makes it much easier for the bank to reconcile. Because it's a check, it's now skipped the details here as far as, added a card number, authority numbers and expiry dates, because it's saying not relevant. If I were to choose cash here, it would basically skip all of this part of the screen to say it's not relevant. So based on the pay method that you put onto this screen, the cursor will go to different areas to say, well, this is the next logical step for doing that sort of transaction. From there, I'd say, yes, I've said that this money needs to be banked. But if I was processing or backdating transactions and said, look, it actually got banked on Friday, but I didn't have a chance to bank it or enter it in the system, then I can still say that it was paid by check, say, pardon me, I don't need to bank it. So for this one, it is a live one, so I do need to bank it. From there, do I need to receipt it? If I say no to receipt here, the system will then take me down and ask me, is it something that's being manually receipted? And if I say yes, will then give me the option to put in the manual receipt number in this field next to that. So for this one, I'm saying no, I do need to receipt it. If I've got a refer to list, so I've got a bequest officer or someone, normally on the second screen of the person's record, I'd have a refer to code, and that will automatically populate here. But otherwise, I could have a list of codes here, or I might have the CEO, or I might have different staff members to alert to a particular donation based on dollar amount or whatever rules you've got set up, and I can certainly then choose the code from there. So for this one, I'm going to say there is no refer to. There's no extra remarks I need to put on the person's receipt. The dollar source code that I've got set up here is something that I can set in the system, and it allows me to add something extra to each of the transaction records to give me a further level of breakdown. So if by chance I'd advertised in a number of different magazines or media, and when the donations came in, I said, look, I've got one appeal, but I want to know how the replies are coming in, then I can create codes to identify how the replies are coming in without having to have 5 or 6 different campaigns for my different segments. Because in this case, people would have received the one mailing, so it's really part of the one appeal, but I want to know, which coupon they've sent in or, which mechanism they've used to actually go through. From there, because I've said one part at the top of the screen, I've now got the amount is $150. The next part of that is choose which campaign it is that I'm putting the money into. For the first one, I'm just going to use the general donation. It skips the next field because that's only used in the case of in memoriam donations. Yeah. So if I were to say, no, this is an in memoriam gift, I then get the option to go across, and based on codes that I've set up previously, I can choose who it was that was being remembered. So for this one, we'll keep it a little bit simple. Okay, and I'm just using my general campaign. Automatically, the ledger code is put in based on what we set up in the campaign record. The letter goes in and the bank account. So when we looked at the previous part of the information and we've set up the campaign record, you can see now where this sort of reflects or impacts on that. So that when I'm processing, the operator doesn't need to know all of the details, they just need to know the purpose of the funds, and the rest of the screen will self-populate. So as I go through, if I've got a comment that I want to add to the donation, I've got that, and that'll become part of the transaction. There are 9 lines here because the maximum number of splits that you can do to a single transaction in Donman is 9 parts. Okay, so for most organizations doing general fundraising, the majority of donations or gifts would be 1 part. You may have 2 or 3 parts, but there's not many places, unless you're doing merchandising and things, that you have a split bigger than that. So in this case, I haven't got a comment to put in, so I can just enter and go through. So $150 from Mr. Smith, and now I've got the option, I'm back on a blank screen, where again I can create a new donor if I need to, or I find an existing donor. Okay, so from there I can choose my next donor, do the same thing, I can go through. Okay, so you can see if there's any error where somebody has put a code onto a person's record, but it doesn't actually exist in my data, then the system is going to stop me and tell me there's something wrong. In this case, I'll say this is an individual record, and then I can save the record. Yeah, so again, if there's anything that I've got in, I am going to get alerted. So if somebody's been mucking around with the data in the background and they've changed something on the screen and not sort of impacted on the whole system, it's not going to let us through. So it is going to alert us that something is wrong with the records as we go through. Okay, so depending on what it was the person gave to do, I can have my source code. Okay, so there's lots of checks and balances sort of built into the system to try and ensure the integrity of the data as we put records in. So where we're talking previously about codes and setup, etc., and I was mentioning that normally we'd only have, unless we've only got one or two people in the organization, we'd restrict who had access to that, because what we just saw then is not the sort of thing I want to have happen, where somebody's created codes and said, oh, I don't want to use that anymore, and instead of doing a proper cleanup or restructure of the data, they've just deleted the codes behind the scenes. It doesn't magically go through and update the whole database. So in this case here, the donation date is stored from the previous one I did, but if I want it to be today's date, I can just do T, and that will change it to today's date. So again, I've got another $150. I can say 2 parts. Then this one I can say cash, and you can see it's now skipped what the previous one went through because it's saying not necessary for cash. So again, yes, I need to bank it, I need to receipt it, and if I go through, the system will now say, hang on, you said 2 parts, but you haven't said how much the first part is. So if I said $100, and that's also going to the general one, okay, and then I said the next part was something different. Okay, so you can see I've got all sorts of things that I can then put through and choose. So I said, okay, they're buying Christmas cards, whatever it might be. Okay. Because it's set up where it's got products, I can then say what product the person is buying. Okay. So in this case here, of course, it's going to muck up because I've sort of put that through. Okay. So from there, I can then say how many items the person is buying. Okay. So it will start to tally up the dollars until I balance what I put onto the previous screen. If I don't balance, it's going to tell me that no, what you said isn't what you've actually put in here. Okay. So again, I can't put in an amount that the system says, no, that doesn't work. Nothing balances based on what you put in. Okay. So if I said, oh, look, I want to try it at that, the system now telling me. Okay. So in order to use the products, I've really got to make sure that I'm selecting the right things. Okay. So in this case, okay, so if I try and get out of there, okay, so you can see all the checks and balances built into the system are going to stop me from mucking something up there. Okay, so it was at 575. Okay, so anything I do with products will do that. If the chance is that I shouldn't have been products and I've got on that screen I don't need to, I can just basically go back up and they'll get me to the point where I can now say, okay, I've put that into the wrong place. I can then go through and say, no, where I want that to go is into a different area. Okay, so I can then choose a different campaign. So in this case, I just use the in memoriam. It then stops me to say who's being remembered. I can choose my person, the ledger code, etc. will go in, and again, I can put a comment on that donation. Okay. So once I get to there, the system now comes up with a prompt to say what I said on the first screen was how many transactions have now been entered. The system will ask me, do I want to check and close that batch? So if I say yes, this is what I want to see, where everything balances. If per chance it doesn't balance, the system will alert me that what I said on the first screen when I set up the batch isn't what I've entered, and as such, the batch won't close. Because what I want to really accomplish at this point is to get all my batches closed before I start doing my banking or my receipting, etc. So I want to make sure that everything balances at the very first point. I don't want to have to just do the entries blindly and then later on try and make sure that everything balances. So that's really the concept behind the batch. From there, once I've finished doing all my entries, and you don't have to do one batch and do all the paperwork, you can do as many batches as you need to in order to process them. So right on the bottom of the screen here, if I can keep that, so you can see that my progress is donations, and at the moment there's 2 donations in the temporary file and what my last receipt number was. So once I've done that, if I said I've created another batch and I've added another 10 donations, it'll just keep adding to that temporary file. Once I've finished all of my entries, that's where I start progressing down through here and saying now I want to do my banking and my credit card listings. So if I say, yes, I want to do my banking, yes, if I've printed credit cards and I'm doing the actual, the old entry method of doing credit cards where I print out the merchant slip and sign it and put in the envelope, then I say, yes, I want to print out the credit card forms automatically. Other than that, if I'm doing gateway for credit card, then when I process on the screen, it will automatically go to the gateway, and the system will change the pay method from Visa or MasterCard or Amex, whatever type I've used, to gateway. And that way, when I do the banking, I don't need to print those out because everything's gone through. So it's sort of like doing it through FPOS prior to the actual entry. Okay. So in this case here, I can say, no, I don't need to print the credit card forms automatically. And if we just do a preview on the report, okay, so it's now showing me what would come out on my bank deposit slip. So when I'm doing the deposit for the bank, I don't need to, rewrite out all the totals of, the drawers' names and the check account details and all of those details. I can basically have that and say, yes, I've got a total of $300, okay, $150 in check, and how many checks I've got. So I can then do that, and this becomes part of my deposit that goes to the bank. Now that I've finished that step, the text on the screen has changed to red to tell me that that's the step that's been completed. The system won't allow me to go back into record donations now unless I go into donation troubleshooting on the side here and modify the progress, or I open the closed batch. Because once all my batches are closed and everything's balanced, I should be able to just progress through this whole cycle and finish it off. Okay, but there is the option that if I've discovered something's wrong or I've printed the ledger report or the receipts and spotted an error, I can go and open the batch and tell it to go back to record donations, because if I change something at this point, it's certainly going to impact on the rest of these things here. Okay, so if I change the amount on a donation, or I had to remove a donation because I accidentally doubled it up or something like that, that's certainly going to impact on my banking or my receipting. And now that I've finished that step, I can create the receipt merge data file. Okay. The system in this case just creates a file called names.txt, and everything to do with the actual processing cycle, the system will back up the last 7 of everything. So all of my reports, the actual data file itself, everything will be backed up. So if something goes wrong, we can fairly easily recover from that and do our merge. So in this case here, the system's allocating the next receipt number. I don't have to worry about any of these things as well, because I'm not doing barcoding or using other addresses, etc. Load word and merge straight away would normally be yes. And down the bottom here is where I would choose the document that you're using to do your receipts. So once you've got your receipt template set up, okay, so even though in this case here I hadn't had that set up as far as telling the system what document to use, once I've done that, the system by default will store that and come up automatically next time. From there, all the fields that come out as part of the receipting, we're at the top here, we can see address 1 to 7 is the address block, which will, address 1 might be title, first name, surname, or it might be positional, or it might just be company, depending on what details we have on the donor. But basically, all of the details that are there, I've got. If I needed to add something else to the receipt letters that isn't there at the moment, yeah, so if I go down and said, oh look, I haven't got how the person paid and I want to show that on the receipt. So then down the bottom of the screen here, I can say what I want to do is add to that output, and just about every field that we've recorded as part of that can be utilized. Okay, so you can see where I was saying before that there's 9, you can split a payment into 9 parts. So this is where you can start to see all of the parts of those things coming out. Okay, so just about everything that's there, you can say, yes, I want to add something to that, or I want to do something from the donor's record. Okay, so again, I can choose the donor file, and every field that's part of the donor's record, I can choose to add to the output, and that will stay as part of the output until such time as I automatically remove that. But the fields that come out by default can't be changed. They will come out no matter what, because they are the core fields for doing a receipt mailing. Okay. So normally, I just have to go here, continue. The system will say generating the thank you data file. It will then open up my document in Word. Okay. So this is where I would have my template set up, where I've got my receipt layout. However you want the receipt layout to be is totally depending on your letterhead or whatever you're using. They're just fields for all purposes. So in this case here, the last merge that it did was unsuccessful because it's telling me here there's an error on the screen to say it couldn't find the letter that person was supposed to get. But ordinarily, hopefully you won't get that. So if I go to mailings, finish and merge, edit individual documents. Okay. So if I'm getting an error like this, I'm getting the rest of the details, I'm getting the name and address, I'm getting the receipt information, but what's not come across is the letter. If I have a look at that, I can see there's a path in the document here that says this is where to go and get the physical text of that letter. So if the path in the document is incorrect, or perchance I've got my document saved in the new format for Word where there are docx, I need to make sure that this field, and normally whoever does the setup or installation for Donman will set this document up for you, and we'll make sure that that all works as part of the installation process, because you don't want to have what I'm having here, where it's saying, hang on, it couldn't find that particular document. But where the error is in this case, normally this is where the text of the letter would pre-fill. So as you can see, based on that field, it's just a field that says go and look at the data. If we look at the data in its sort of raw form here, I can see here, this is where I've got the document name. And so if perchance I've told Donman that the document's called letter gen, but in my actual directory or my folder I've called it letter general, of course the two aren't going to match. Computers are very literal and they don't like to do grey. Okay. If perchance I got to this point and said, oh, hang on, I've mucked that up, the two options I've got are to actually go and rename the letter to be what Donman has got, or I can change the data directly by going down the bottom here in Word, and I can change the letter code here so that I can get my merge finished, and then I can sort out the actual letter itself later. Okay. But for most purposes, we won't get an error, but it's really just at this point here to show you that if we do get an error, it is really just a field that says, we'll show you exactly where my letters are stored, and from that I could then go and have a look at my drive and make sure that the document, in this case my letter gen, was actually physically there so that I can do the merge successfully. So once these documents are set up, they're normally made as read-only so that we can't, or the operator can't accidentally muck them up, so that we have minimum issues, and the only issue then is like this one here, where it's saying you can't find that letter. Okay, so they're just something that I haven't done properly in my setup. Okay. So if perchance I said, okay, look, I've done that and I've opened Word and I've had an error, whatever's happened, I don't need to go back into Donman and create the receipt merge data file because it is still there. And until I do the next receipt run, I can use that at any time at all. So from there, I could minimize Donman. So what I want to do is go into Word, if it will behave. Okay, so if I then go into my directory, I'm looking for this folder here. Okay, so you can see here that my document wasn't called letter gen, it was called letter general. Yeah. So this happens quite a bit, unfortunately, where people have sort of set up their structure thinking one thing, and when they've done the document, they've called it something different. So the two options I've got at this point here, I say, hang on, based on the code I set up in Donman, it was just called letter gen, so I can rename the physical document. Okay, so then I can cancel that. If I then go back in now and open my receipt template, go back to mailings, finish and merge. Okay, so now I'm not getting the error message, and the text of my thank you letter is being imported as part of that whole mechanism. Okay, so the setup itself is fairly simple, and as you can see, it's a recovery for if something goes wrong is fairly easy to do. Okay, so you don't have to be a mail merge guru or anything like that to do this, because the only two parts of it really are the receipt layout or the actual letter itself that doesn't come in, and the word itself will give us the error messages. When we do the credit cards, as I was mentioning a little bit earlier, there are a number of mechanisms for getting the credit cards to the bank. The oldest and probably the way we should not consider doing it at the moment is doing the merchant file, where we print out a summary of all the credit cards and stuff in plain text. We sign the form, we fold it up, stick it in the envelope, and that becomes part of our bank deposit slip. For most of the major banks, like the Westpac, ANZ, NAB, etc., all have different file formats, where based on credit cards that I've recorded through the system, I can use one of the programs to create a file in the format that the bank wants, and instead of me doing it the way of just doing a printed form, etc., the system will allow me then to log on to internet banking and upload the credit card details, and it just does basically a batch authorization of those. So there are a number of mechanisms for credit cards depending on what your final requirement is. In this case, I haven't processed any credit cards. So if I were to run this program, it would really say there's nothing to print. Yeah, but just so that we can see what it does do, okay, it says must be run after banking's run. If we do Amex and Diners, because depending on your bank and different things, sometimes you can't put them through the bank, so you still have to do them by printing out the form and sending it directly to Amex or Diners. The majority of banks nowadays, or of more recent times, I think, have got that ability where you can put them through the same as you can MasterCard and Visa cards. From there, we have the merchant number for the run, and the system will automatically create a credit card file. So down here, we print and export, and the file that it creates would be the file that we basically upload to the bank. The ledger posting report will be the summary of the money that I put in the ledgers. So where I split a payment, each payment becomes its own part. So in this case here, because they've all gone into donations, even though it was general and it was in memoriam, they've all gone into the general donation or the donations received ledger code. So I've now got the total. And as you can see, based on how I put the money in, whether I said the money was to be banked or pre-banked, I'll get different totals for that. And that certainly helps me when we're putting that into the accounting system. If there's any GST, then that will show over the right-hand side here, and there'll be a total of GST for this lot as we go. Normally, that is the report that would then be sent to accounts that they'd use to do like a batch or a bulk entry into the accounts for the day, instead of having to put in every single transaction, because that's what we're trying to rely on Donman for, is for the individual transaction level. For the higher level, we're really just saying, look, we want to have a total amount for that processing cycle. If I had processed the payment and I'd referred it to somebody, this is where I do the refer to report. And in this case, I said, no, there wasn't any referred to, but I can now go through and do the end of day. So once I do this step here, the temporary file, down the bottom here, will become update, will be my progress, and there'll be no donations in the temporary file. So this is the step that will update the live data with what I've entered as far as my donations or from my temporary donation file. So it'll update the donor, the donation, the campaign, everything else will happen as part of this process. There's not much to it. So as I go through, I basically just enter. Unlike the other one, I don't have a print preview, because this is one I normally print out because it is my audit report. So when that comes up, in this case, a bit of a delay because I'm printing it through the PDF printer. Okay. So you can see on the report, it will have your organization name, the date that we've updated the donors, and then have pretty much all of the details. So where I've changed the date on the first transaction, I can see the donation date, but I can see from the date here that that was the date of entry. Okay, so this is normally the report that we would print and store, because it becomes my audit trail for all of the transactions. Okay. So now I can see end of day update is in red. Down the bottom here, update 0. There's no donations in the temporary file. My receipt number is incremented. So that is really the complete start to finish of doing the manual entries in Donman. But as I did mention before, There's certainly different programs for doing either an auto deduction batch run or doing import of web donations or peer-to-peer fundraising donations. Anyway, that concludes this part of the introduction series to Donman. So I'll go back to my start screen and leave you there for now.